Welcome to Lesson 2. In this lesson, we'll discuss how to conduct an interview. We'll talk about how to open and close an interview. We'll discuss working with probes in particular. And finally, we'll think about documenting an interview. Before we begin, it's important to remember that an interview, even though it may seem like a one-way street, is actually much more like a dance. Who leads and who follows can often change. Thinking about an interview as a conversation or a relationship is essential to strong interviewing. So at the beginning of an interview, the opening, you'll introduce yourself and you'll also introduce the project. This is important for your respondent so that they know why they're being spoken to. Give them a sense of what the project is and why you've chosen them to interview. Second, depending on your institutional regulations and the specificity of the interview, you may need to discuss informed consent and confidentiality issues with your respondent. Third, it's quite common for interviews to be recorded on a device like a phone or an audio recording device. So do make sure that you ask your respondent if they give you permission to record the interview. If they do not, you'll need to lean more heavily on your notes. Next, give the respondent an overview of the scope of the actual questions. You don't need to tell them about every single question that you're asking, but give them a sense of the trajectory of the interview, its beginning, its middle, and its end, the key themes that you'll be talking about. This will make them more comfortable, but also it will give them a sense of what is to come. Finally, get a sense from your respondent of what their time allocation is. It may be that that day they only have 15 minutes to speak, but your interview guide is roughly 30 minutes long. You'll need to alter accordingly. Just as it's important to have structure for beginning the interview, it's important to have structure for ending the interview, what's called closing. In closing the interview, of paramount importance is that you thank your respondent for their time and for their insight. Next, it's good practice to share your contact information with the respondent if they don't have it already, so that they may be in touch with you if they have further questions or concerns about the interview itself or the project. Next, be sure to ask them if they have questions. And lastly, it may be that you want to ask further questions at a later time, reaching out to the same interviewee again. You'll need to ask their permission to do this, so make sure you ask if follow-up is possible. We've discussed probes as a key element of interviews. Probes are prompts that elicit further information that follow a STEM question. I like to think of probes as a way of changing the elevation or the specificity of an interview. If you think about a plane flying at 10,000 feet, it sees things very differently than a plane that's flying at 30,000 feet above the ground. One gives you a much more macro view. One gives you a much more on-the-ground view. Probes are really helpful tools for changing the altitude of your interview specificity. If your questions are really broad, probes can get things more specific. If things are getting too specific and in the weeds, probes can broaden out again. Probes are sometimes scripted into your interview guide. They can be built in as tools to get further specificity or further generalization that you plan for in advance. And they also help you think about questions that may miss the mark. But probes can also be unscripted, which is to say they can emerge within the context of an interview. So it's always good to have a few probes in your back pocket. So some examples of probes include, tell me more about that. This is a really easy and common probe to ask a respondent. It just asks them to give you more details, or maybe to give an example. Or you can just urge them to say more. Another way to ask is to get more information about process. A respondent may tell you about a particular phenomenon, but you're not really sure how it works, so simply ask them, how does that work? In terms of getting specific, it's often common for respondents to give you the most direct answer to your question, and that may be sufficient. However, it's often helpful to have concrete examples. People don't tend to give concrete examples unless asked, so it's important to ask them. A common probe and a very useful probe is, can you give me an example? We've talked about asking questions and probing. We've talked mainly about the speaking that is done in an interview, but it's important also to remember that an interview is like a juggling act. You must speak, you must listen, and you also must write. Writing in the course of an interview can be confusing. It's like doing two things at once. You have to listen and then also take notes while it's happening. But it's essential that you take notes. An interview without notes is almost like an interview that did not happen. The most common form of note-taking during an interview is what's called jotting. For jotting, you simply need a small notebook and a pen. Jotting is quick notes to yourself during an interview while you're responding to speaking. This means that you'll need to combine attention to your notes with eye contact with your respondent. You're often looking at three things, in fact. You're looking at your interview guide to ask questions, you're looking at your respondent to get eye contact and connection, and you're also looking at your own notebook to take notes based on what you hear. Jottings aren't necessarily direct dictation of what is said, but they might include key words or phrases that your respondent utters that make you think you'll need to return to it later on, that they may be important analytics or answers to your questions. You will expand your jottings later in field notes, but jottings are in some ways like bookmarks for your field notes. They're ways for you to cue yourself later on to return to a particular moment in the interview through a particular idea or phrase or conversation. Remember, if you don't write it down, consider that it didn't happen. Think about jotting as just as essential to an interview as the questions themselves. Even as we talk about the tools of interviewing, it's imperative that you think about the ethical implications of the interview itself. Make it a priority to discuss with your teacher and your mentors whether or not and how to clear the interview through an ethical review process, such as at a university's institutional review board for research. Remember that an interview is a conversation, and it's also a relationship of trust. Participating in the interview may accrue risks for the respondent. Addressing these at the outset is imperative before beginning the interview process. To review the process of an interview, remember that it involves close attention to opening and closing the conversation. It involves close attention to working with probes and learning how to jot down information. And lastly, it involves assessing ethical issues from the outset.